I watched them enter the corridor because the orders said to observe, not to stop them. Each day they waited for movement that never came, and my reports grew heavier than my rifle. Doctrine promised they would withdraw, but the ground held them where it chose. When the ravine emptied, nothing felt finished, only accounted for. In late November 1942, along the western approaches to Stalingrad, the operational situation had hardened into a narrow band of contested ground. The Red Army's 62nd Army still held fragments of the city and its outskirts, while German forces of the 6th Army continued to probe for local advantages even as the wider front shifted. Temperatures were falling. Snow lay unevenly across the steppe and in the shallow ravines that cut toward the Volga. Visibility varied hour to hour, shaped by low cloud, smoke from artillery fires, and wind that carried fine ice crystals across open ground. The immediate sector lay beyond the ruined industrial districts, where rubble gave way to frozen fields broken by shell craters and abandoned farm structures. The Germans used these approaches to test Soviet positions with battalion-sized movements, attempting to locate weak points and force withdrawals before the onset of deeper winter. The Red Army, stretched thin and short of ammunition, relied on layered defenses. Infantry in shallow trenches, scattered minefields, registered artillery zones, and small numbers of trained snipers assigned not only to shoot but to observe. One such sniper had been in position since before dawn. His assignment that morning was routine. He was to watch a shallow corridor between two low ridgelines that German patrols had used repeatedly over the previous week. From a concealed firing point dug into the frozen earth, he observed through binoculars rather than his rifle scope. This was standard practice. The rifle was reserved for specific targets. The eyes were used first to understand movement. His work followed a pattern shaped by months at the front. He arrived before light, checked the camouflage netting that broke the outline of his position, and cleared frost from the lenses. He noted wind direction, the condition of the snow crust, and the sound carry across the field. He recorded times and distances in a small notebook kept inside his coat to prevent the ink from freezing. None of this was remarkable. It was the daily routine of a sniper assigned as much to reconnaissance as to marksmanship. The corridor he watched was not wide, perhaps 400 meters across at its broadest point. On the German side, the ground rose gently, masking their assembly areas from direct Soviet observation. On the Soviet side, the land dipped toward a shallow ravine that ran roughly north to south. Previous fighting had scarred the area. Dark patches in the snow marked old shell bursts. Broken fencing lay half-buried. A burned-out truck stripped of useful parts sat tilted into a crater near the ravine's edge. In the days leading up to this morning, German movements had followed a predictable pattern. Small groups advanced cautiously at first light, probing for fire. When they encountered resistance, they withdrew, sometimes calling for mortar fire, sometimes not. Larger formations had not yet committed themselves to this corridor, which suggested either uncertainty or preparation. Shortly after first light, the sniper observed signs that differed from earlier days. Through his binoculars, he saw movement behind the ridgeline that lasted longer than a patrol's approach. Shadows shifted. The glint of metal appeared briefly and disappeared. The sound carried faintly, a low, continuous murmur, rather than the sharp, isolated noises of a small unit. He noted the time and adjusted his position slightly, careful not to disturb the snow crust in front of his firing slit. The wind was light from the northwest, steady enough to carry sound, but not strong enough to erase tracks quickly. He scanned the likely avenues of advance, marking in his mind the registered artillery reference points already known to his battery. The German battalion began to move forward in stages. The initial elements advanced cautiously, maintaining intervals that suggested training and experience. They moved in files that spread into loose lines as they crossed the first open stretch. From the sniper's position, individual faces were indistinct, but the shapes and spacing were clear. This was not a patrol. It was a formed unit, advancing with purpose. The sniper did not fire. His orders emphasized restraint. Snipers were not to reveal their positions unless the value of the target justified the risk. Instead, he observed and relayed information. He used a field telephone line buried beneath the snow to report movement to a nearby command post. His report was factual and brief: unit size, direction of movement, estimated strength, and speed. As the battalion continued forward, the early signs of difficulty became apparent. The leading elements slowed as they approached the first band of disturbed snow that marked the edge of a minefield laid weeks earlier. German engineers had cleared lanes through similar obstacles before, but here the ground had shifted under shell fire and freeze-thaw cycles. The markers were unreliable. The sniper watched as the formation compressed slightly, the rear elements closing distance as the front hesitated. He saw men probe the ground with bayonets and rifle butts. Progress slowed to a crawl. This pause exposed the battalion to Soviet artillery observation, though no fire came immediately. The Red Army often waited until units were fully committed. From his position, the sniper could see into the shallow ravine beyond the minefield. It was a natural choke point, with steep sides that limited movement and offered little cover once entered. Previous engagements had shown that units caught there had difficulty redeploying quickly. He noted that the German advance axis pointed directly towards this feature. The sniper's rule remained observational. He tracked the advance element by element, noting when the first section cleared the suspected mine area and when the second followed. He counted intervals. He estimated depth. He listened to changes in sound that might indicate supporting weapons being brought forward. The first detonation came not from artillery, but from the ground itself. A mine triggered near the front of the formation, throwing snow and earth into the air. The blast was contained by the frozen ground, but it was enough to halt movement entirely. Men dropped to the ground. Others moved forward cautiously to assist, their spacing collapsing further. The sniper recorded the detonation and its location relative to known reference points. He did not celebrate or react outwardly. Mines were impersonal. They functioned whether watched or not. German officers attempted to restore order. Through binoculars, the sniper could see figures moving along the line, gesturing, pointing forward and to the flanks. The battalion resumed movement in short bursts, each advance followed by another pause. Progress continued, but momentum was uneven. As more of the battalion entered the corridor, the sniper observed that supporting fire was limited. There was no immediate smokescreen, no sustained mortar suppression of the Soviet side of the ravine. This suggested either a shortage of ammunition, uncertainty about Soviet positions, or confidence that the advance could proceed without heavy preparation. The weather contributed its own constraints. The low cloud ceiling flattened sound and limited aerial observation. German artillery observers would have difficulty adjusting fire accurately under these conditions. The Red Army, familiar with the ground and with pre-registered coordinates, held an advantage. Still, no artillery fell. The German battalion pressed forward, now committed beyond the point where a simple withdrawal would be easy. The leading elements began descending into the ravine. The sides, crusted with ice and loose snow, made footing uncertain. Men slid and regained balance. Spacing tightened further. The sniper's notebook filled with short entries, times, positions, formations. He noted the absence of flank security. He noted that the battalion's depth now extended from the far side of the minefield into the ravine itself. He reported these observations in a second brief call. There were other signs of strain. Stretcher bearers moved forward earlier than expected, indicating additional mine casualties beyond the first visible blast. The advance slowed again, then resumed. Each pause increased exposure to indirect fire, but still none came. This delay created a sense of waiting that the sniper recognized. It was a familiar pattern. Fire often came after silence, not during confusion. As midday approached, light improved slightly, though the sun remained hidden. The German battalion was now largely within the corridor, with only its rear elements near the original line of departure. From the sniper's vantage point, withdrawal would require turning men around in confined space under observation. Advance meant pushing deeper into territory already mapped and registered by Soviet units. The sniper adjusted his position to maintain sight lines as the battalion moved further away. He did not fire. Individual targets were visible at times, men standing, moving laterally, silhouetted briefly against snow, but engaging them would have revealed his position without altering the larger situation. His role, as assigned, was to watch and to ensure that what happened next would not go unseen. By early evening, the battalion had ceased forward movement altogether. The formation compressed within the ravine and its approaches, as if waiting for orders or support. The sniper observed little lateral movement, suggesting that attempts to maneuver around obstacles had been abandoned. The unit appeared fixed in place. He recorded one final entry for the day, noting the battalion's position and the continued absence of supporting fire. The situation had reached a pause that felt structural rather than temporary. Units did not linger in such exposed ground without consequence. Experience suggested that once a formation settled into a confined space under observation, options narrowed rapidly. The sniper remained in position as light began to fade. He did not yet know how the situation would resolve, only that the battalion's advance had reached its limit. The corridor was now full, the exits constrained, and the conditions unchanged. Observation continued. By mid-afternoon on the same day, the operational picture had clarified without becoming simpler. The German battalion remained largely stationary within the ravine and its approaches. From the sniper's position, movement had shifted from forward progress to internal adjustment. Small groups repositioned along the ravine floor, seeking marginal cover behind folds in the ground or against the frozen banks. The rear elements, still nearer the minefield, appeared uncertain whether to advance or hold. The pause was not accidental. It reflected a growing mismatch between German doctrine and the conditions on the ground. Battalion-level advances were designed to maintain momentum, using supporting fires to suppress defenders and engineers to clear obstacles quickly. Here, momentum had been lost early, and supporting elements were either delayed or ineffective. The terrain, combined with Soviet preparations, had imposed a rhythm that German planning did not easily accommodate. The sniper continued to observe without firing. His reporting now included changes in posture and behavior rather than simple movement. He noted that German soldiers were digging shallow scrapes into the frozen soil, an indication that they expected to remain in place longer than planned. He observed runners moving rearward, likely carrying messages rather than relying on radio, which was vulnerable to interception and interference. Late in the afternoon, the first indirect fire arrived, but not in the volume or pattern expected for an assault. A small number of German mortar rounds fell on the Soviet side of the ravine, scattered and imprecise. The rounds burst in the snow with dull thuds, throwing up white plumes that drifted quickly in the cold air. The fire was insufficient to suppress known Soviet positions and did not appear coordinated with any renewed movement. From experience, the sniper recognized this as probing fire rather than preparation. It suggested uncertainty about Soviet dispositions rather than confidence. He relayed this assessment to the command post, noting both the limited scale and the poor adjustment of the rounds. As daylight faded, the battalion settled into a defensive posture. Nightfall in this sector brought not concealment but constraint. Movement became slower and more hazardous as temperatures dropped further and visibility narrowed. The ravine, already a funnel by day, became a trap by night. Sound carried sharply in the cold air, and any attempt to withdraw would likely be detected. The sniper remained in place through the night, rotating observation with a second man from his unit. Their routine alternated between binocular scanning and listening, with long periods of stillness broken by brief, purposeful checks. German movement was minimal. Occasional voices carried faintly, then stopped. No large-scale redeployment occurred. At first light the following morning, the situation had not improved for the battalion. The formation remained compressed, its elements now clearly fatigued. Frost covered exposed equipment, men moved stiffly. The rear elements, closer to the minefield, showed signs of confusion as tracks overlapped and markers had been obscured by drifting snow. The sniper noted that the battalion had made no serious attempt to disengage during the night. This suggested either orders to hold or an assessment that withdrawal would be more dangerous than remaining in place. Both possibilities carried risk. Holding in a confined area under observation invited indirect fire. Withdrawing without preparation risked disorganization and losses in the minefield. Soviet artillery fire began mid-morning, but not as a continuous barrage. Instead, short, concentrated missions struck specific points along the ravine. The pattern indicated pre-registered targets rather than reactive fire. Rounds fell with accuracy on clusters of activity, then ceased. The intent was disruption rather than destruction. The sniper observed the effects with professional detachment. He noted that the artillery strikes further compressed the battalion, pushing men into fewer usable spaces. He observed stretcher parties again, now moving under more visible strain. The battalion's internal cohesion appeared to weaken as units mixed under pressure. German responses followed doctrine. Attempts were made to establish perimeter security within the ravine. Machine guns were positioned to cover likely approaches, though their fields of fire were limited by terrain. Officers moved along the line, attempting to maintain order and readiness. Yet these measures addressed symptoms rather than the underlying problem. Throughout the day, additional German mortar fire attempted to suppress Soviet observation points. Some rounds fell closer to the sniper's position, forcing him to adjust his concealment and minimize movement. He remained undetected, a result of careful positioning and the attacker's limited situational awareness. The operational limitation became clearer with each passing hour. The battalion could not advance without clearing obstacles and suppressing defenders, tasks requiring coordination and support not currently available. It could not easily withdraw without exposing itself to mines and observed fire. Doctrine offered solutions for each problem individually, but not for their combination under these specific conditions. By late afternoon, German losses were no longer confined to mines and artillery. Small arms fire began to take effect as Soviet infantry exploited observation from the ravine edges. The sniper observed isolated engagements where German soldiers attempted to move laterally and were engaged from concealed positions. These were not decisive actions, but cumulative ones, adding to fatigue and attrition. The sniper himself engaged only once during this period. A German observer attempting to establish a vantage point near the ravine's edge exposed himself briefly against the snow. The sniper fired a single round, then returned to observation. The engagement was precise and limited, consistent with his role. He recorded the shot and its time, then resumed watching the broader situation. As evening approached, the battalion showed signs of impending failure without yet collapsing. Communications appeared strained. Runners moved more frequently. Orders, when they came, seemed reactive rather than planned. The absence of a clear course of action, advance, withdraw, or hold, became evident in the battalion's inconsistent movements. The sniper's reports reflected this ambiguity. He described a unit losing coherence not through sudden defeat, but through sustained constraint. This distinction mattered. Units that collapsed suddenly could sometimes recover. Units that eroded gradually often did not. Nightfall again, with temperatures dropping further. The ravine became quieter but not calmer. Occasional flares illuminated the snow briefly, casting sharp shadows and revealing frozen forms pressed against the banks. The sniper and his partner remained still, conserving energy and maintaining watch. By the second night, the battalion's predicament was established. It remained forward of its original line, confined in unfavorable terrain, under intermittent fire and without clear resolution. Doctrine assumed that such situations would be temporary, resolved by reinforcement or maneuver. Here, neither appeared forthcoming.
The sniper continued his routine, noting small changes that indicated mounting strain, slower reactions, less disciplined movement, longer pauses between actions. These details, accumulated over hours and days, formed a picture more complete than any single engagement. As the night deepened, the situation reached another pause. The battalion held, but only just. The conditions that had limited it on the first day remained unchanged, and the cumulative effects were becoming harder to ignore. Observation continued, steady and unbroken.
The turning point did not announce itself through a single decisive action. It emerged through accumulation of observation, constraint, and quiet adjustment made at a level below formal orders. By the third morning, the German battalion's situation had shifted from temporary difficulty to structural failure. The corridor that had once appeared merely contested now functioned as a controlled space, shaped almost entirely by Soviet observation and fire discipline. At dawn, the sniper noted a change not in movement but in intent. German activity resumed earlier than on previous mornings, yet without the cautious probing that had marked the first advance. Instead, small groups attempted to reposition simultaneously along the ravine's length. This was not coordinated maneuver. It resembled an effort to relieve pressure by redistribution rather than by decision. The sniper recognized the pattern. Units in such situations often attempted to solve confinement by spreading within it, creating the illusion of flexibility. In reality, this increased exposure. He tracked these movements carefully, noting that several groups moved into previously registered artillery zones without realizing it. Snow cover had obscured markers, and earlier shelling had altered reference points. Artillery fire followed within the hour. This time it was more deliberate. Short missions fell in sequence along the ravine, not saturating it but methodically denying sections. The intent was containment rather than annihilation. Each strike forced survivors into narrower spaces, reinforcing the same constraint that had stalled the battalion from the beginning. The sniper relayed updated positions and effects. His reports now included assessments of morale inferred from behavior. Men failing to maintain spacing, increased clustering around perceived cover, slower response to incoming fire. These were indirect indicators but reliable ones. They suggested that the battalion's ability to execute complex movement was degrading. It was during this phase that the sniper adjusted his own role. Officially, his task remained observation and selective engagement. Unofficially, he began to prioritize identifying command elements and specialists rather than exposed infantry. This adjustment was not written in any order. It arose from experience and from the recognition that disrupting coordination would further limit an already constrained unit. The decision carried risk. Engaging higher-value targets increased the likelihood of detection. Yet the conditions favored such action. German counter-observation remained weak, and the terrain limited their ability to triangulate firing positions accurately. The sniper selected firing opportunities carefully, spacing shots widely in time and changing aim points to avoid patterns. Over the course of the morning, he engaged sparingly. Each shot was taken only when movement or posture clearly identified a role beyond that of a rifleman. The effects were subtle but cumulative. After each engagement, there were longer pauses before movement resumed. Orders, if issued, took more time to propagate. Groups hesitated without clear direction. The battalion attempted a coordinated withdrawal late that morning. The effort was partial and poorly synchronized. Rear elements began moving back toward the minefield, while forward elements remained under fire. The ravine, already crowded, became more so as opposing flows overlapped. This created confusion rather than relief. The sniper observed this attempt closely. Withdrawal under observation required speed and coordination, neither with which the battalion could now muster. Mines triggered again near the rear, halting movement and forcing the column to stop and compress once more. Artillery fire resumed shortly after, targeting the newly congested area. By early afternoon, the withdrawal effort had ceased. The battalion settled back into a static posture, now in worse condition than before. Losses had increased, and the psychological effect of failed movement was evident. Men remained in place even when safer positions were nearby, indicating a reluctance to move without explicit orders. The sniper's position remained undiscovered, but the risk increased as German mortar fire grew more focused. Several rounds fell close enough to shake loose snow from his camouflage. He adjusted minimally, knowing that movement itself could be detected. His continued presence depended on discipline rather than concealment alone. At this stage, the battalion's failure was not measured solely in casualties, it was measured in options. Advance remained impossible without support that had not materialized. Withdrawal had been attempted and failed. Holding in place continued to erode strength. The unit existed in a narrowing band of possibility. Late in the day, a change occurred within the Soviet lines as well. Artillery missions became less frequent, not because targets had vanished, but because containment had been achieved. The battalion was no longer maneuvering in a way that required constant correction. Observation sufficed. For the sniper, this marked a shift from active engagement back to pure surveillance. His task now was to ensure that no significant movement went unnoticed. He tracked the battalion's perimeter, noting attempts to establish stronger defensive positions within the ravine. These efforts were constrained by frozen ground and limited tools. Progress was slow and incomplete. As dark approached, German activity diminished further. Fires were not lit. Equipment was repositioned cautiously. The battalion appeared to be preparing for another night in place rather than for movement. This choice, implicit or explicit, acknowledged the reality that initiative had been lost. The sniper remained in position into the night, rotating observation with his partner. They spoke little. Notes were exchanged rather than words. The situation no longer required interpretation. It required persistence. By the end of the third day, the battalion had become fixed in a space it could neither leave nor exploit. The sniper's unofficial adjustment, targeting coordination rather than presence, had contributed to this outcome, but it was only one factor among many. Terrain, preparation, and doctrine all played their roles. The turning point had passed without ceremony. The battalion was still present, still armed, still nominally operational. Yet its function as a maneuver unit had effectively ended. Observation continued, steady and unemotional, as the situation moved towards its next phase. The consequences of the earlier day's actions became apparent not through sudden collapse, but through the steady narrowing of possibilities. By the fourth day, the German battalion no longer attempted coordinated movement. Its posture had shifted fully from offensive intent to localized survival. What remained was a collection of companies and sections occupying adjacent positions within the ravine and its immediate approaches, linked more by proximity than by command. At first light, Soviet observation confirmed that the battalion had made no significant effort to reposition during the night. Tracks in the snow showed only short movements between nearby points of cover. The minefield to the rear remained undisturbed, its cleared lanes now partially obscured again by drifting snow and debris. Any renewed attempt to withdraw would require daylight work under observation. The sniper noted another important change. German officers were less visible. Where earlier days had shown frequent movement along the line, figures gesturing, directing, correcting, now such activity was rare. Orders, if issued, appeared to be passed quietly and over short distances. This reduced exposure, but also reduced coordination. Soviet artillery fire resumed mid-morning, again in limited but precise missions. The intent was no longer to shape movement, but to deny recovery. Fire struck areas where digging activity had been observed, collapsing shallow scrapes and forcing men to relocate repeatedly. The cumulative effect was exhaustion rather than immediate loss. The battalion attempted to respond doctrinally. Requests for increased fire support were evident from the pattern of German mortar fire, which grew heavier but remained poorly adjusted. Without clear observation of Soviet positions, these fires achieved little. Ammunition expenditure increased without corresponding effect, further limiting future options. At this stage, tension emerged not only on the battlefield but within the system directing it. German doctrine emphasized maintaining combat effectiveness through timely withdrawal and reorganization, yet withdrawing the battalion would require admitting that the advance had failed and that the corridor was effectively controlled by the enemy. Higher command appeared reluctant to authorize such a move without clearer justification. This hesitation had consequences. The longer the battalion remained in place, the more its condition deteriorated. Casualties mounted slowly but steadily. Medical evacuation was limited by terrain and observation. Supplies reached the unit irregularly. Cold compounded every difficulty. The sniper's role remained observational, but the stakes of detection increased. German countermeasures intensified as the battalion searched for explanations beyond terrain and artillery. Mortar fire began to focus on likely observation points along the ridgelines. Several Soviet observers in adjacent sectors were forced to relocate. The sniper narrowly avoided exposure when a salvo landed close enough to collapse part of his firing slit. Despite these efforts, German counter-observation remained ineffective. The ravine limited sight lines, and Soviet camouflage discipline was well practiced. The sniper adjusted his position slightly during a lull, moving only inches to re-establish cover. He continued to watch, now more carefully than before. Late in the afternoon, a small German element attempted a breakout along the ravine's northern edge, seeking higher ground. The movement was tentative and quickly detected. Soviet infantry fire engaged it at medium range, halting the attempt within minutes. Survivors withdrew back into the ravine, leaving equipment behind. This failed effort reinforced the battalion's predicament. Initiative, once lost, proved difficult to regain. Each unsuccessful action narrowed confidence further. The unit's behavior reflected this reality. Fewer attempts, shorter movements, longer pauses. As evening approached, the battalion's perimeter contracted again. Men clustered where they believed cover was best, even when this increased vulnerability to indirect fire. This instinctive response to sustained pressure was understandable, but counterproductive. The sniper observed it with professional neutrality, noting positions and times. Within the Soviet command structure, the situation was now considered stable. The battalion was contained and no longer posed an immediate threat to adjacent sectors. Resources could be allocated elsewhere. Observation continued, but the urgency of constant fire diminished. For the sniper, this phase represented the peak of risk without action. He was closest to detection when the enemy was most desperate, and his value lay in remaining unseen. He fired no shots that day. Observation alone was sufficient. By nightfall, the battalion remained in place, weakened and constrained. The consequences of earlier decisions, advancing into unfavorable terrain without adequate preparation, delaying withdrawal, relying on doctrine unsuited to conditions, had accumulated. The system that directed the battalion had failed to adapt quickly enough, and now options were largely exhausted. The night passed quietly, broken only by occasional flares and distant artillery. The sniper and his partner maintained watch, recording minimal movement. The situation had reached its peak in terms of stakes. What followed would not be shaped by maneuver, but by resolution.
By the morning of the fifth day, the operational situation had resolved itself without a formal announcement. The German battalion no longer functioned as a maneuver element. What remained in the ravine and its approaches were scattered groups holding shallow positions, conserving ammunition, and awaiting orders that did not materially change their circumstances. The corridor that had drawn the advance now contained only remnants. Soviet observation confirmed the change early, There was no coordinated movement at first light, no renewed attempt to advance or withdraw. Instead, individual soldiers shifted positions cautiously, often remaining under cover even when movement might have reduced exposure. The pattern suggested exhaustion and acceptance rather than preparation. Higher-level decisions followed this reality rather than shaping it. German command authorized a limited disengagement later that day, not as a maneuver but as a recovery effort. Small groups were instructed to withdraw when possible, using available cover and moving independently rather than as a formation. This approach acknowledged what had already occurred. The battalion could not be extracted intact. The withdrawal unfolded over many hours. Some elements moved successfully under the cover of intermittent smoke and low visibility. Others triggered mines or drew fire when crossing exposed ground. Losses continued, though not dramatically. The process was slow, uneven, and incomplete. The sniper observed these movements carefully, reporting routes taken and points of failure. He did not fire. The purpose now was documentation rather than engagement. Soviet forces had achieved their operational aim: denial of terrain and degradation of enemy capability. Additional losses were incidental rather than required. By nightfall, the ravine was largely empty. A small number of German wounded and dead remained where evacuation had been impossible. Equipment lay abandoned: rifles, packs, machine gun parts, frozen into the snow. The corridor, once active, returned to stillness. In the following days, Soviet units advanced cautiously into the area, confirming what observation had already established. There was no counterattack, no reoccupation attempt. The ground was secured with minimal resistance. Institutional response on both sides reflected the nature of the outcome. In German reports, the engagement was recorded as a failed advance halted by mines, artillery, and adverse conditions. Responsibility was distributed broadly: terrain, weather, enemy preparation. There was no single decision identified as decisive, and no individual held publicly accountable. On the Soviet side, the engagement warranted little formal recognition. It was one of many localized successes during a larger operation. Reports emphasized effective use of terrain, observation, and fire discipline. Individual contributions were noted internally, but rarely elevated beyond unit records. The sniper returned to routine duties in another sector shortly afterwards. His notebook, filled with times, distances, and observations, was submitted and archived. He did not claim personal credit for the outcome, nor was any offered publicly. His actions fit within doctrine, even where unofficial adjustments had been made. The system absorbed the result without comment. The battalion, he observed, did not reappear as a cohesive unit in subsequent operations. Its losses, material, personnel, and cohesion were absorbed into replacements and reorganizations elsewhere. In official histories, its experience was indistinguishable from many similar engagements across the front. The legacy of the episode lay not in a dramatic reversal or a named victory, but in the demonstration of cumulative constraint. Observation, terrain, preparation, and restraint combined to neutralize a force without requiring decisive battle. Such outcomes rarely attract attention, yet they shaped the daily reality of the war. For the sniper, the engagement reaffirmed the value of patience and accuracy over volume. His work was measured not by confirmed kills, but by continuity of observation. The battalion advanced, stalled, degraded, and withdrew under watch. None of it went unseen. In the years after the war, records preserved the outlines of the engagement, but not its texture. Names were reduced to unit designations. Actions became summaries. The quiet labor of observation faded into statistics and footnotes. Yet the outcome remained. A battalion advanced and did not return as it had arrived, not through sudden destruction, but through a sequence of limitations applied consistently over time. If this account added clarity to one small episode of a vast conflict, consider supporting continued work on overlooked operations and individuals whose roles were recorded quietly, without ceremony.